Every few months, a story makes the news that stops people cold. You read it and something in you just reacts, not with an opinion, not with a preference, but with a certainty that what happened was wrong on every level. Wrong in a way that no argument could talk you out of. Now, you don't need for me to give you an example. You already have one in your head right now. Something you saw or heard about that made you think, I don't care what anybody says, that was just wrong, period. Hold on to that feeling because that reaction, that immediate gut level certainty, is actually one of the most important pieces of evidence in this entire series. And in this episode, we're going to follow it all the way to where it leads. Now, before we go any further, I need to distinguish between two very different ways of thinking about morality, because depending on which one is true, that changes everything. The first is called moral relativism. This is the idea that morality is not fixed. It changes depending on the person, the culture, or the era. What's wrong for you might be fine for someone else. What's wrong in your country might be acceptable somewhere else. There are no universal moral truths. Morality is just a matter of opinion. The second is called moral realism. This is the idea that some things are actually objectively wrong, regardless of what any individual thinks, regardless of what any culture decides, regardless of when or where you live. Moral truth exists the same way mathematical truth exists. 2 + 2 = 4 whether you believe it or not. And torturing an innocent person for entertainment is wrong whether a society approves of it or not. Now here's a question I want you to think about. When you pictured that news story that stopped you in your tracks on how wrong it was, were you thinking like a moral relativist or a moral realist? Were you thinking, well, that's bad in my opinion, or I guess it's okay in their culture? Or did something inside you just say, no, that was actually wrong. Not wrong for me, that was just plain wrong. If that's the case, then it means that you already believe in moral realism. You just may not have had a word for it until right now. And if moral realism is true, if some things really are objectively wrong, just plain wrong, then we have to ask the next question. Where does that objective moral truth come from? Ask the world and they'll say it comes from evolution. And honestly, it's not a bad answer, so let's actually think it through. The idea is this. Over millions of years, human beings who cooperated with each other survived better than those who didn't. So evolution gradually wired us to feel certain things. Empathy, fairness, loyalty, disgust at betrayal, because those feelings help the group survive. In other words, morality is just the emotional programming evolution built into us to keep the species alive. There is something genuinely true in that. Cooperation does help groups survive, and those feelings are clearly real because we all have them. But here's the problem. If morality is just evolutionary programming, then it isn't actually true. It's just useful. Think about it this way. The reason you feel those news articles are wrong isn't because something was actually wrong. It's because your ancestors who had that feeling survived better than those who didn't. Your outrage is just a survival reflex, just like a sneeze is a reflex. A sneeze isn't telling you something isn't true, it's just your body reacting to something in your nose. If moral outrage is the same kind of thing, just a reflex wired in by evolution, then it's not actually telling you anything is wrong either. It just goes off like a sneeze. But that creates a serious problem because you don't actually live that way. When you see a genuine injustice, you don't think, well, my genes are telling me I should feel outrage right now. Nobody thinks that way, ever. You think this is wrong, period, full stop. Now, there are two different questions here, and people mix them up all the time. Question 1, why do we feel like certain things are wrong? That's a question about biology, survival, and feelings. Evolution can answer that. But question 2, are certain things actually wrong? That's a completely different question altogether, and it has nothing to do with feelings. It's asking whether some things are truly objectively wrong regardless of how anyone feels about them. That's a question about truth, and evolution can't begin to answer that question. This is where C.S. Lewis comes in again. And I keep coming back to Lewis in this series because he was not a man who came to faith easily. He was one of the sharpest minds of his era who spent years as an atheist. And the moral argument was one of the things that finally got through to him. His argument, called the argument from conscience, goes like this. You are aware right now of a moral law, not a law that you invented, not a law that your culture voted on. That moral law is something that you feel pressing on you from outside, a sense of what you ought to do, what you ought not to do. That doesn't just go away because it's inconvenient. You know this law exists because you've already broken it. Let me give you a simple example. Maybe you watched someone get made fun of or left out and you said nothing. You didn't do anything wrong technically, but you felt it anyway. That quiet sense that you should have done something. That wasn't social pressure. That wasn't fear of getting caught. That was something deeper, a sense of having violated something real. Lewis points out that this is strange if the universe is purely physical. Physical laws don't give you obligations. Gravity doesn't tell you that you ought to fall, you just fall. The law of thermodynamics doesn't tell you that you ought to conserve energy, you just do. Physical laws just describe what happens, but the moral law tells you what you should do, and you feel its weight even when you ignore it. So where does it come from? Lewis argues that the most reasonable explanation is that behind the moral law, there's a mind, a lawgiver, something or someone that is not just powerful, but good, and whose goodness is a standard against which everything else is measured. That's not a leap of blind faith. That's following the evidence of your own conscience all the way to where it leads. Now, I know you might be thinking, wait a minute, what about? Don't worry, I got you. So let's handle the three most common objections to this. Objection 1. Morality is just what society agrees on. If this were true, then there would be no basis for ever saying that society ever got it wrong. But you know that's not true. When we look back at societies that practice slavery or genocide or the systematic abuse of people based on race or gender, we don't say, well, that was fine for them. We say that they were wrong. We say they violated something that was true even when they didn't recognize it. That judgment only makes sense if there's a moral standard that exists above and beyond what any society decides. Objection number 2 is morality comes from empathy. We don't need God for that. Empathy is real and it matters, but empathy alone can't carry the weight of objective morality. Here's what I mean. Empathy is selective. You feel it more strongly for people who you are close to, people who look like you, people whose suffering you can easily imagine. History is full of people who had deep empathy for their in-group and none at all for those outside of it. Empathy explains why you care about some people some of the time. It doesn't explain why you're obligated to care about everybody, including strangers, including people you've never met, including people who can't help you in return. For that, you need something beyond empathy because empathy is just a feeling and feelings come and go. But when we say every human being has dignity, that they matter regardless of what they look like or what they can do for you, we're not talking about a feeling. We're talking about something that has to be true. Empathy alone can't get you there. And objection 3, even if there's a moral law, that doesn't prove the Christian God. This one's fair and it's also true. The moral argument on its own doesn't get you all the way to Christianity. What it does get you to is this. If objective moral truth exists, it needs a foundation. It has to come from somewhere. And that foundation has to be something that is itself genuinely good, not just powerful, not just old, but morally authoritative. A personal being whose nature is goodness itself. That's not nothing. It's not the full picture yet, but it's another piece of it, and we're going to keep building. So here's the point. You came into this video already believing in objective morality. You just didn't know it. The moment you felt that something was genuinely wrong, not just personally distasteful, but actually really wrong, you were already making a claim that goes beyond personal preference. You were appealing to a standard that exists outside of yourself. That standard has to come from somewhere. And the most coherent explanation, the one that actually accounts for the moral truth, feeling so real, so binding, and so non-negotiable, is that behind the moral law, there is a moral lawgiver. You don't have to accept that yet, but I want you to notice that you simply can't dismiss it either. Because every time you feel genuine moral outrage, every time someone strikes you as not just unpleasant, but actually wrong, you're feeling the weight of something that the purely material universe has no business producing. Think about that. We've now looked at 2 arguments for the existence of God, one from the origin of the universe, one from the reality of moral truth, and both of them point in the same direction. Along the way, we've also answered the third of those 4 big questions I laid out in episode 1. Why does injustice feel objectively wrong? Now you have something to say to that. But I want to shift gears in the next episode because so far we've been dealing with arguments, and arguments are important, but there's another kind of evidence that's more personal and honestly more difficult to dismiss because it comes from inside of you. It's that feeling you've had. Maybe you have it right now, that even when life is objectively good, something is still missing. That no matter what you get or achieve or experience, there's a longing underneath it all that nothing quite satisfies. Episode 4 is called Does God Exist? The Longing That Nothing Can Fill. If this episode gave you something to think about, hit the like button. It helps other people find the series. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And if you know somebody who thinks that morality works just fine without God, share this with them. I think it'll start a conversation worth having. I'll see you in the next one.